Ready? And we're recording. And we got some wine back there. We're all good to go. Branding and everything. Hey, everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So thrilled to have you here. We are so excited to continue this virtual author event series, which we have been doing since 1964. It feels like, no, actually just since spring of last year, but we've done almost, or maybe we're just at about 200 of these virtual events, which we've done. And we've really talked to some amazing people, and it's been a great way to stay tethered to our audience and also to reach a lot of new people. I'm sure there are people watching tonight that don't know what Magic City Books is, haven't been to Tulsa before, and that's one of the perks of this virtual world that we're living in. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching. We have a lot of fun stuff coming up. I won't give you the full rundown, but I would encourage you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and you can see everything. I will mention briefly that next Tuesday, we're going to be doing a program with the great Louise Erdrich and Ann Patchett in conversation together. That will be on Tuesday, so that will be pretty special coming up. So you can see all the other things we have. If you don't know about Magic City Books, we are a nonprofit bookstore here in downtown Tulsa. We're actually, just for context, in the historic Greenwood neighborhood. If you know the history of Tulsa, there's been a lot of news about the race massacre of 1921. We're just a couple of blocks from historic Greenwood Street where that took place. And you know, coming soon, the Bob Dylan Museum will be here in Tulsa, about a block away. So we're going to be in a pretty interesting space. So if you get to town, come see us, come see what's going on. I've been a fan of Gary Shteyngart's work for a long time. He's been someone kind of on our secret wish list that we've been wanting to do something with. And while I certainly would love to have him here so we can go eat some food and hang out here in Tulsa, it was a thrill when we heard we were going to get the opportunity to do something for this new book. And what can be said about the new book that hasn't been said by the raves in the New York Times or Terry Gross or Fresh Air fawning over Gary and loving all this and getting all the praise that it so deserves. And, you know, if you haven't read the book, and I'm sure some of you are deep into it at this point or maybe plowed through it like I did, it's so good that there are moments when you kind of think like, if this was the product of the pandemic, maybe it was kind of worth it. You know, I don't know. You know, maybe if this was the end result. No, not really. But it is that good. You know, you're going to have this, you know, pretty amazing experience reading it. And also, I've been so thrilled to see. You know, we've actually done events for. There've been a lot of kind of first draft of history books about this post-pandemic and the world we're living in right now. And I've been kind of curious to see how some of my favorite writers would deal with the world we're living in now, what the fictional take on the way we live now would be. And I think this is the first great response in that area to the world we're living in right now. Also just a hoot in so many ways as well. I'm excited also tonight to be getting to be a member of the audience as well. We always love when we get to kind of have a dynamic duo. And I first met Dinaw Mengestu at an event for PEN America. I run one of the 7 national chapters for PEN America here, and had the opportunity to go up and meet the board of trustees and obviously a ton of amazing writers up there, and got to tell them a little bit about what we do here in our little corner of the woods, and was thrilled when we were able to bring him back for moderating duties this evening. Most importantly, if you have questions tonight, we want you to be putting those into the Q&A, and we'll pull some of those as we go. And if you would like to get a copy of Our Country Friends, which you certainly need, we're going to make that quite easy for you tonight here in the chat. We will be kind of randomly putting reminder messages in here. All you have to do is click that little link. You go to Magic City Books, you buy a copy from us. You support the work we do through our nonprofit efforts here at Magic City. You get a copy of Gary's book. You put him on that bestseller list where this book belongs, and all is right in the world if you do all those simple things. So couldn't be more happy to have both of you gentlemen with us tonight. I will turn it over to you for this conversation, and really, really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you.
Great. I think that means it's just us now, Gary.
Hey.
Thank you, Jeff, for how is that? For inviting me to do this conversation with this wonderful writer and friend and also neighbor.
Yes.
as it turns out. I think as Jeff noted, there's a Q&A space open, so we really want people to start throwing out questions, and as much as I can, I will take the questions and fold them into the conversation rather than just leaving a designated time at the end, although we can do that as well. So Gary, this has been a wonderful and sort of brilliant launch to this book. And in preparing for this, in reading the book, I was like, what what is going to be left to say by the time we actually have this conversation, even though the publication's only been for 2 days. And one thing I was thinking of maybe starting with is, the book has been described, I think rightfully so, as a great pandemic novel, and a lot has been made about the way it actually deals with this very intense moment that we have lived through and are still living through. But I also wanted to maybe step back away from the pandemic context in which the narrative takes place and actually maybe start with the title, and what seems to me also an essential element of the book, which is the idea of friends, and the multiple layers of friendship that take place throughout the story, and the title being Our Country Friends. And a part of me is like, well, who's the our in that narration? And two, maybe just even beyond that, what friendship means and does in the context of this story, where a group of people have gathered together to shelter in place in a farmhouse upstate New York while the pandemic begins to sort of eviscerate the city around them.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dinaw, for being here with me. You are one of my country friends, as per the title. And as you mentioned, we are almost neighbors. We live in the same tiny village in upstate New York. And thank you to Magic City Books. I wish you and I, Dinaw, were there right now. I've heard such wonderful things about Tulsa, which yes, has been, of course, on people's minds in the last couple of years for important reasons. But I've been to Oklahoma once, to the University of Oklahoma, Norman, is that the city, or Normal, something like that? Please correct me in the chat. I had a wonderful time. Those students were terrific. I ate a steak about the size of my head. It was really very juicy, just really well done. So I can't say enough good things about Oklahoma. Bring me back when we can travel more and do more stuff. I would love to see the store in person. Yes, Our Country Friends. It's funny you mentioned that, because I think at the beginning I wanted to call it My Country Friends, because even though this isn't a first-person novel, there's an omniscient narrator that goes between the 8 main characters, or really the 8 characters in the book. I really wanted to call it My Country Friends, and my editor sort of pointed out, well, it isn't a first person. Let's stick to what this is, and the idea of our is sort of all of us, including the readers. The idea was that they become our friends as one reads the book. When the pandemic started, I, like many of you, probably felt very lonely. I was upstate, where I spend the majority of the year, as I know you do as well. Most of my time is spent in the country. I was alone. I made a little pod with some friends of mine, 2 people that I know you know, Dinaw, and they hung out with us and we grilled barbecues. But I was still very, very lonely. And I began to think, it was interesting, I wasn't even lonely for my parents, God bless them, great people, but I became very lonely for people I haven't seen in a very long time, who I wouldn't have been lonely for, I think, if the pandemic hadn't happened. And I found myself calling people all over the world, in Germany and in the UK and Canada, and just talking about the past. And they were really eager to connect as well. So for some reason, the pandemic brought out, I think, our most loneliest selves, and the selves that needed to connect the most. Now, when that happens to writers, whenever you feel an overwhelming emotion, there's 2 reactions. One is to try to fight it, and the other is to sort of give into it. Sometimes you fight it because you think, oh, it's just an emotion and there's really no intellectual basis to it. I just have to, up my, my Xanax use or something like that. I just got to fight it. But sometimes you really want to go with the flow. And here I thought, well, what else am I going to do? I was writing a dystopian novel at the time, in which New York University began to conquer all of Manhattan, and half of Manhattan belonged to NYU. and that was kind of a silly book. I mean, I think, only New Yorkers would have really gotten it, and it relied too much on humor, and it was a semi-dystopian novel. But as the pandemic started, I thought, oh my God. And I had written dystopian books before, but I thought, wow, I am actually living in the middle of a dystopian world in which not only was there a pandemic, but there was also a lot of political dysfunction. And when there's catastrophe, the former Soviet citizen in me also gets very excited because I start, things falling apart is the natural state that I'm used to. An entire empire, the Soviet Union falling apart is how I began my life. So I became quite excited about it. And by the end of March of 2020, I know most people I knew at this point were trying to bake bread. That was their sort of project. They wanted to see new ways to bake bread. One person I know was making elk jerky, which sounds delicious. I never tasted any, but it sounds like a really good project. But I thought I would try to do a novel based on, one, my loneliness, and two, the fact that friendship became more and more important as the hours and then weeks and then months began to drag on. So you had a second part to the question, Dinaw. What was it? I'm sorry, you're muted.
That's sort of it. But about because friendship in the book actually, it's put under a certain pressure, right? The pandemic brings these 8 people together, and there's a question about how they all happen to be that in the house, and the fact that Sasha, the main character, sort of gathers them. He brings them into this compound that he's created. But the friendships are also, I was thinking of them, as there are these types of families. We talk about as pods, but in the case of these characters, actually, friendship is closer to family. It's a new type of family, and thinking about the different connective tissues that bind these characters together, where, at one point, one of the characters notes, as immigrants or second generation immigrants, there's a history of really deep friendships that they form as children that are maintained in these sort of remarkable ways. And you can see that here. So maybe some of that is the friendship becomes more than just friendship, it becomes family, but the pressure is to maintain that, right, is part of what's so fascinating here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us, those of us who live in families, I mean, we became both closer to our families than ever. And also we became, I think, quite irritated by our families as well. There was no way other than that because everyone was living in such close proximity. My immigrant friends, and in this book, there's 2 Russian Americans, there's 1 Indian American, there's 1 Korean American, there's 1 Korean, and there's a girl adopted from China who's 8 years old. All of them come together because all the other people are fleeing from New York, and the main character has these sort of bungalows, these little cabins. But as I was growing up, our problem was that whenever we turned to our parents, and our parents came from such difficult places. I mean, India after partition, Korea after colonization and the Civil War, Russia after Hitler and Stalin, that it became that in some ways our parents were too traumatized to understand the America of plenty, right? And I know that you also write about the immigrant experience in your books as well. And so it was, we turned to each other as almost surrogate parents. Everyone took on a different role. So I was known as the writer. So I would write my friends' resumes and cover letters when they were trying to get a job. Another friend of ours, much like the character of Karen in the book, was very good at sewing stuff for us. So she sewed wallets for us. And then she took us to cheap shops to get us dressed in the latest fashions on the cheap. So there was a lot of really fun kind of parenting going on. And I think that also creates a lot of pressure because when your friends become more like family, every betrayal, every sense of hurt takes on a different kind of cadence. And I think that's what happens in this book when they're all crammed together for really the duration of the pandemic.
Yeah, and that's what's so at times sort of moving and powerful and unexpected about the book is that even as this pandemic is sort of raging and beginning to sort of grow outside of the house, it's these small private betrayals that begin to accumulate inside of this space that could almost be happening in the absence of the pandemic, but the pandemic is a kind of necessary crucible and sort of pressure that brings them together, but that too also Is it bringing out the worst in them?
In some,
Is it?
yeah, yeah, I think in some ways, both the best and the worst, as crisis often does. That's why reading about societies in turmoil is so interesting in some ways, because you're always wondering who's going to do the best and who's going to do the worst. And I think that's what happens to all these characters in this book. There's both betrayal, there's love, there's new love formed, there's all kinds of political missteps. When I was writing the book, I was watching a Japanese reality show that my wife and I became addicted to, called Terrace House. And if you haven't seen it yet, I think it's on Netflix. It's absolutely hysterical because it's a reality show on a very familiar premise. So just like in my book, there's 6 or 8 young people are put together into a house in Tokyo, and it's a reality show. So some fall in love, some become friends, etc. But because it's Japan, everyone is also incredibly polite to one another. So unlike the American version where people would be screaming and yelling and stuff, everyone is incredibly polite, but it's very small aggressions, a bowl of soba noodles not cooked correctly, or tiny little things that drive people to complete extremes of insanity. And as I was writing this book, I was watching that Japanese reality show Terrace House, and I was also rereading a lot of Chekhov, one of my favorite Russian novelists, short story writers and playwrights. And that kind of 19th century pace was present in both Chekhov stories, the Terrace House, the show, which felt very 19th century in the way people interacted with each other, and the book itself. I mean, this is in some ways, I don't want to say nothing happens. A lot of stuff does happen in this book, but it's in some ways my slowest book, as opposed to some of my, crazier satires that I wrote when I was much younger.
Yeah, and the book it's so aware too of the multiple sort of various influences. Somebody in the Q&A noted the big chill, which is referenced by one of the characters, and are you having your big chill moment? Don't you know there's a pandemic going on? This isn't a time to try to recreate that. Of course, there's the Decameron, which sort of looms over the this kind of structure in a certain way. But then Chekhov and there's a kind of real there's a very real conscious conversation happening throughout the text. And I was looking at the opening lines of Uncle Vanya, where it's a country, in the English translation, of course, a country house on a terrace. In front of it is a garden in an avenue of trees and an old poplar stands. And then there's the opening lines of your book. The house on the hill was in a tizzy. Workmen's trucks streamed up the long gravel driveway. And so there's a similarity, but also a complete, also, dramatic division or divide in what's happening here, where you're not recreating Chekhov at all, though.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you mentioned that line, because I realized this book has so many influences. What's that line? Bad writers borrow, good writers steal. I realized that when you read that line, the house on the hill was in a tizzy, which is the first line of this book. It reminds me actually now of the opening line in Anna Karenina, which I'm trying to translate from Russian. Everything was topsy-turvy in the house of Oblomov, right? Of Oblonsky, rather, sorry, in the house of Oblonsky. And yes, very much an influence. And also, whoever mentioned the big chill it's very funny, because when the first time I talked to my editor and I was telling him, well, I've actually gotten rid of that crazy novel about NYU, whatever I'm going to try to do. And I said to him, think of it as Chekhov meets the big chill. I'm doing that kind of Hollywood phrasing, where it's always something meets something when they're trying to sell a project. And I said, yeah, think of it as Chekhov meets Big Chill. Now, the Big Chill was a huge influence on me as a kid, because when it came out, it was a huge success. It came out in the 80s, so some of the audience may not even remember it or heard about it, but it was a hugely successful movie in which the plot is they're a bunch of University of Michigan graduates, and one of them commits suicide. They're all very close friends, and they all come down for the funeral of this one friend. And just like in my book, different liaisons take place. Some people fall in love and so on. But when I saw that film, my English wasn't even that hot, because I was an immigrant from the Soviet Union. So I couldn't follow exactly, and also I was too young to understand all of the, all of the things that were happening on screen. But I remember thinking, I don't understand this, but it is very sophisticated. And I wish someday to have friends like these friends on, on the screen. And then in the middle of the pandemic, when this novel was already halfway through, when I'd already written half the draft, I said, oh, what the hell? I'm just going to rent The Big Chill. And I watched it and I found myself deeply moved. I mean, it's pop culture, etc. But it's actually a really good movie, I thought. I mean, maybe it's my nostalgia playing a trick on me, but I was actually quite moved by it.
Yeah, it is moving, and the characters obviously, I could totally see the influence or the relationship between them. But then also there's this like the difference though, right, with these characters. You talked a little bit earlier about about being an immigrant, and we noted that all these characters have roots in other parts of the world.
Mm.
Um, but this isn't and I sort of use that term with a lot of reservation, an
Yes.
immigrant novel. But yet
Yeah.
the fact that these characters are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants is an important part of what shaped their relationship, not only to each other but also to their world. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, because they're in an interesting place where they've left the kind of cosmopolitan landscape that they're comfortable and familiar with, and they've settled in a place that isn't actually
Yeah.
home
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Um,
very interesting. Yeah, no, I think that's a great sort of line of questions because for me, when I grew up in New York and lived primarily in the city, I lived for a time in Europe, but for me, the most non-New York I ever felt was when I began spending most of my time in the country, and I learned to do things that in my mind were always American in quotation marks. I learned how to drive. I learned how to go to a mall and buy these gigantic. I love buying this the bounty that you can get in these like 60 packs family size, and I cram it into the trunk. To me, that's the kind of America that as a immigrant kid growing up in an immigrant community was, we just didn't do that kind of stuff. You'd go to the local bodega and there would be another immigrant behind the counter and you would both not speak English well and you would sort of negotiate the price of a toilet paper, etc. And so much of the stuff that I would watch on the television screen, whether it was The Big Chill or any of the John Hughes comedies, with Molly Ringwald, felt like an incredible world, but felt almost like an alien world, both to me and to the other people I befriended. So a lot of the people in this book were high school students in this math and science high school. And likewise, I went to a math and science high school in Manhattan called Stuyvesant High School, where I think right now it's about 80% immigrants, if not more, primarily from Asia, some from Russia. And that's where I made my first American friends. I went otherwise to a very kind of wealthy school, and we were very poor. We were on, welfare benefits and stuff. So for me to make my first friends required to meet people who had very similar backgrounds to my own. And those are, and that conceit is brought forward in this book, where almost everyone, whether they're successful or not, has come from these immigrant roots.
Yeah. And now that they find, they're successful by and large, right? They've achieved varying degrees of success. Some of them quite financially successful, but they're all, they're educated. They have cultural capital, and now that they're in the country and in the countryside, that's where I found the other sort of, outside of the pandemic, this other interesting tension begins to rear its head. They call themselves, or the narrative at times refers to them as the colonists,
Yes.
which I thought was a really interesting sort of recasting and reuse of that sort of word, because they're landowners. They talk about this property that they own in a working class environment, and their sense of belonging. I'm wondering if it's their sense of belonging to that place, or if their sense of belonging to America in the larger political context in which the story is taking place begins to kind of be challenged and undermined. There's a subtle dread that's lurking underneath this narrative all along.
There's a dread that's lurking, and I think it's a dread that I certainly began to feel. When I left Russia, and when Russia collapsed in 1991, I always thought that Russia would become more and more like America, would become more democratic, would adopt the rule of law, would lessen its corruption. But in some ways over the years, America became more and more like Russia over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think as immigrants, people have this fear, because they come from such unstable societies, as do most of the people in this book, that as they watch America, for example, not being able to deal with a pandemic, with other countries having better outcomes with the pandemic, given all our medical advances and the wealth of the country, we become worried about where we've come to, even though we're of course Americans by this point as well. But there's this kind of fear of disequilibrium, and I think all of these immigrant characters begin to feel it too. And as always, when they begin to fear it, they begin to turn to one another for support. There's a character who I love called Dee Cameron, which is kind of a joke on the Cameron. And she is not an immigrant. She's from the South, but she grew up very poor. And she's written this very incendiary collection of essays about growing up poor in the South. And she's, quote unquote, of the left, but she still flirts with the far right just to get more attention. And she finds herself very confused by being in a house, by being surrounded by these, 7 other refugees to the countryside. And even though she is of the countryside and is able to understand what's happening outside of this estate, she is confused by the inhabitants and how to, who constantly mention things about their homelands. And she's trying to fit in any way she can, even though she is one of the few native-born people in the book.
Yeah, there's another tension inside the narrative, right? Which is this close group of friends who are all immigrants who have a vocabulary, a history, a way of communicating that's sort of unique to them. And then there's Dee Cameron, who is Sasha's former student, who's American, has a Southern accent. And then there's the actor, and part of me is wondering if you thought of the two of them almost standing in a certain way, right? In a very messy and blurry way. Lines aren't clear, but at times in tension to this group of friends, not only because they're outside of that group of friends, but also because their place in the society and the culture is different than theirs. And these, people who are nervous about what might happen to them as they walk down the street.
Yeah. I wanted to put so there's a character called the actor, and he's the only character in the book whose name isn't revealed until the very end, and it's a very prosaic name, but the actor, capital letters, is a very, very famous actor who shows up because he's writing a script with the owner of this house, Sasha Senderovsky, and he shows up and he is sort of like a grenade that goes off. He adds a lot of tension to the plot because everyone falls in love with him. He falls in love with Dee. Other people fall in love with him. There's these endless sort of very Tolstoy-like love triangles going on, one after the next after the next. And I kind of wanted him because I wanted him to be a symbol of ultimate privilege, because this country doesn't have a monarchy. We don't really have an aristocracy, but the way we treat our celebrities borders on that. And it's not even, because I write for TV quite a bit, I get to meet some of these people, and they're not very happy people. They feel very encumbered as well because they have this whole personality that they constantly have to support, which in some ways is not terribly dissimilar from the way an immigrant has to constantly think of how he or she represents himself in American society too, right? Or any group. This is not, obviously the actor is not marginalized, and neither is really Dee. But because they're public figures, they constantly have to think about the same way an immigrant has to think about it in every daily interaction, especially in the last 4 or 5 years where the political climate against immigrants, especially visible immigrants, has changed so dramatically.
Yeah, it was interesting watching how that political climate becomes more and more palpable throughout the narrative, right? The sort of first sort of impetus is the pandemic and the sort of desire and need to flee the city and gather together, and then bit by bit the complicating layers of what it means to actually take shelter and to leave. That it doesn't just happen. People may go and bake their bread, but there are consequences to that. And one of those consequences might be that sense of confronting a kind of almost an insecurity or an anxiety about where they and how they fit in, not only in relationship to one another, but perhaps to this sort of larger country and landscape like that they belong to.
Yeah. Well,
and Dee has this interesting privilege. Well, no, continue.
No, go ahead.
No, continue. Sorry.
Oh yeah.
No, I was just saying, and like Dee.
This is great. Oh, Zoom.
The Zoom lag.
The Zoom lag.
I was going to just note that, like, as you noted, Dee has the ability to kind of flirt with both sides of these political spectrums in order to kind of pump up her reputation, get more attention, which is something obviously the other characters sort of can't do. They walk around slightly nervous of this, truck that's driving around that may or may not, pretend something ominous for them.
Yeah. No, as this was happening also, the anti-Asian violence began in different parts. There were two sort of things that were influencing the writing of those. One was of course what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, and then the other part of it was the violence directed specifically toward immigrants. And where we both live, I remember going to some cafes which had signs about the China virus and stuff like that. And my wife is Korean American, and so I began to feel a little. Nobody ever did anything bad toward us specifically, which I think maybe is because in a small town everyone kind of knows one another. But there was a feeling of the subtext was a little bit ominous, and I wanted to sort of emphasize that because Dee and the actor have the privilege of, as you were saying, taking whatever they want from the great baskets of ideology and doing this and doing that. Although toward the end of the book, Dee does something bad and gets called out on Twitter and other social media. So the book also handles sort of what some refer to as cancel culture, but really is a sort of putting your foot in your mouth. And but for immigrants, there's so many of my friends began to fear going out, and even not just in the country, but in the big metropolises, in New York and in San Francisco. So I kind of wanted to investigate that in the novel as well, and because I have such a group of people that represent really all parts of America, I was able to bring that to the forefront as well.
Yeah, but also at the same time, they're not, by no means are they victims to anything. And one of the things the book it seems also really interested in kind of navigating is what a different type of representation, perhaps. And I'm wondering how conscious you were of what that could be, of an immigrant class that is post the new arrival striving generation. It's a generation that's comfortably and sort of deeply rooted and has found its sort of home and its wealth and its education in America.
Yeah.
And yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I was just reading there was a really nice review of the book on slate.com by Laura Miller, who's a wonderful writer. And she was talking about the immigrant part, but she was sort of talking about how this novel was in some ways about the death of a certain kind of creative class, or at least the importance that they think of them, the way they think of themselves as being important. Because one thing that happens, someone like Dee, but also someone like Sasha, Sasha has been writing novels about the Russian immigrant experience, and all of a sudden he feels that he's not that relevant to the culture, just as Dee's tales of growing up poor in the South, but poor and white, don't seem as relevant to the culture, to what the culture wants to explore now. And so these people are constantly, because I think every kind of artist, or certainly every kind of creative culture worker, that's a horrible phrase, is always, what do these people seek? It's usually relevancy, and being canceled almost seems fine to someone like Dee, if only it would give her some more relevance. If only people would remember who she was and maybe just bought her books out of hate, So there's a kind of struggle on behalf of all of these different people, including the actor, to stay in the public eye, because everything shifts so quickly in our internet-driven culture, that these people, even though they're still in their 40s and the actor's even younger, and Dee is in her early 30s, they're already feeling like, well, they're being supplanted by newer generations all the time, which I hope makes the book somewhat funny too, because I think there's a lot of humor as there's a kind of, it's almost like, I don't know, Succession. I worked a little bit on that show, Succession, but for rural intellectuals, if you can imagine what that would mean.
Yeah, no, the way you navigate actually their failures, it's I don't want to say joy, but because there is so much humor, and that humor opens up the characters to all these other sort of emotional ranges and experiences with them, because you're able to really laugh with them, and sometimes at them, but more oftentimes alongside of them, and that sort of Sasha's role as this novelist who once had a career to failing, and I think Dee at one point notes that none of them are actually as successful as they might think they are. They're all on the kind of downward slide.
Yeah.
Some may be more aware of it than others, but nonetheless. But maybe in particular, I'm wondering about how you think of it as because the book is also so vested in literature and literature in a really broad sense, in talking literature as a thing that can talk to the politics, to reality TV in Japan, versus maybe also what happens in the sort of film television world, that Sasha gave up or circumscribed this really promising career to do that instead.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny because I dabble obviously in both worlds, and I mean, literature is always my home and always has been, and there's nothing more fun than writing a novel. But TV has this kind of grandeur because it has such great audiences, and people will talk, about it to such an extent. We'll talk about Succession, or now Squid Game, which I was also a little bit addicted to. So obviously, there's more cultural relevance to something like television now. But at the same time, I think someone like Senderovich, when we're in our 40s, it's very interesting because in the competitive society that America is, your stature and status are constantly quantified by so many things. Your Amazon ranking, your Twitter followers. We're such a status obsessed culture. I know you've lived in France for some time, and I've lived for a while in Italy. And I would know friends for years and still not really know what they did or how successful they were. Which I think is really funny by American standards, because once you meet someone here, the first thing you ask, well, what do you do? But when you're in your 40s, this society kind of gives you a scorecard and tells you how well you've done by this and this and this matrix, and especially when you get friends together who haven't seen each other in so long. And again, this is sort of what the Big Chill was about too, right? You begin to compare who succeeded in what way, who didn't succeed, who has a family, who doesn't have a family. And all of these things inspire, I think, a kind of competition that maybe was much more dormant when everybody was just 19 years old and just graduated from high school, going to college in the city, and just, everyone had dreams, but it was still too early to tell who was going to fulfill those dreams or not. To me, that tension between seeing characters who were friends as kids and are now friends as adults, with mortality really sort of rearing its ugly head on the horizon, that's a delicious tension. That's a tension I haven't explored before, because I think my previous books have been about love between romantic partners, and so many of my books were about me trying to figure out what the hell happened to my family, my parents and myself. And there's a little bit of that because Sasha's wife Masha is a Russian-speaking psychiatrist who deals with Russians of my parents' generation, and they are all like my parents, they don't want to get the COVID vaccine because they have all this misinformation, and they don't want to, they're very, I wouldn't even say of the right, of the very far right. And they're constantly dabbling in all these conspiracy theories about George Soros and microchips and all this kind of stuff. So all of that is in the book as well. But in some ways, the pressure of the parents is gone, or not gone, but it's been internalized. And a lot of these characters are now, they're carrying their parents' role inside them, but they're not so worried about the actual parents who are back in Queens or Los Angeles or Florida. And they now have to deal with the parents that they've internalized within themselves. And to me, that's a different kind of challenge to write about that, because it's very easy to write, I could write my parents, in my sleep, because the things they say are so funny. And so, they naturally bring out a kind of tension, because they obviously trigger me in a big way, as they would anyone of my generation. But here, the parents have been sort of moved off stage. And what we have are the actual descendants and how they deal with each other.
Yeah. There's, I'm tempted to ask you to read maybe just a paragraph.
Sure.
On 145, that bottom paragraph that begins, people were dying in the city.
People were dying in the city. Yes. Okay. Just this paragraph, right?
Yeah.
Okay. People were dying in the city, some more than others. The virus had roamed the earth, but had chosen to settle down there, just as the parents of Masha, Senderovsky, Karen, and Vinud had chosen it 4 decades ago as a place to escape the nighttime reverberations of Stalin and Hitler, of partition and partition, of the pain that radiated not in distant memory, but cracked outright from their own father's hands. Yeah, I guess that kind of summarizes exactly what we've been talking about. Yeah.
No, it's because it's also, the virus in that moment becomes a type of migrant.
Yes.
And the very thing that these people have been trying to escape, that the parents tried to escape, the type of tragedy that the parents thought that they were escaping, has found their children anyway.
That's right.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a really good reading. Yeah. No, the virus has migrated, as you said, but also this is at a time when politically migrants are thought to be a kind of virus. right? Yeah. So there's a kind of duality there. That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't think of that.
Yeah. There's a question that was asked earlier about how do you invent your characters? Or are they write them, or are they based off of real people?
Well, I think, and maybe Dinaw, you will disagree with me, but I think, you know, when you're a writer, you're like a doctor. You're always on call, and Chekhov, of course, was a doctor in his spare time. You're always looking out for ways that people express themselves. And for me, it's not even just dialogue, it's tics, you know. So there's one example that I love. There's one person I know, a wealthy Korean like Ed, one of the characters in the book, a Korean from Korea, not a Korean American per se, who whenever he talked to a woman that he liked, or just was in any situation, social situation where he was nervous, he would put his hand on his ear as if he were contacting, you know, this was before even cell phones. This was in the 90s, you know, and it was almost like he was, you know, I don't know, he had like one of these AirPods in 1991. And we were always cracking up about it, you know. Oh my God, he's contacting Sputnik again, you know. But I think he was really just, he was just very nervous. He was a very sweet guy in many ways. And this is what he did. This was like a tic. So I didn't borrow all of his character, but I did borrow that part of him. And then they connected it with some other thing that was interesting in another person, you know. So it's sort of like Etch-a-Sketch or build Mr. Potato Head or whatever it is. You take from different things. The only difference I think between this book and some of my earlier books would be that usually if I had a character like that, you know, if I had somebody who did this, I wouldn't have the narrator comment about that. I would just have it out there, and the idea was you would laugh at somebody who was so awkward. But here I talk about how in his own mind, he knows that he's doing it, and he knows that it looks ridiculous, but he just can't stop it. It's almost like a safety blanket. So when he falls in love with Dee, that Southern essayist, and, you know, he's talking to her and he's holding on to his ear and he's thinking, God damn it, why am I constantly holding on to my ear, you know? So that's, I think, my sort of idea of trying to not just be nicer to my characters, but try to reach out and understand them a little better. Somebody had written in the Q&A, for example, how did you treat, Sasha's last name is almost the same as that of one of contemporary Russia's writers. Is that intentional? I don't know who you're thinking about, but I actually did steal the name from a friend of mine who is a writer and an academic named Sasha Senderovich. And what I loved it's just such a post-Soviet Jewish name, Senderovich. And there's a joke about that in the book because his nickname is Return to Sender, because all of his scripts in Hollywood get sent back for more rewriting because, you know, he can't quite get it right. So for me, that was, I thought, okay, I have to use this name. And I remember I sent him the book. And I said, can I just use your name, Sasha Senderovich rather? See, there you go. And he said, can you just change it a little bit? Because, you know, I don't want people to do Google searches and, you know, my name will come up as this character instead of, you know, because he has his own career as a writer and an academic. So I changed it from Senderovich to Senderovsky. But that's another example of how writers steal little bits of things. I like the name, so I wanted to use it in its entirety, and I settled on using most of it. Yeah.
Did you, because in addition to stealing maybe or borrowing from people that you sort of know, what about, because part of what's so interesting is the intimacy actually of those friendships. Is that something that felt like you were able to draw on from your own life, having this sort of large group of very close, but also, you know, complicated histories and relationships?
Yeah, you know, I grew up an only child. Russian families, I always joke, we don't breed in captivity. All the Russian families I know are always one child, maybe two, you know, at most. We're just really, really small families. And yeah, absolutely. I would say for me, not having siblings, having parents whom I loved but couldn't exactly rely on for advice and other things because their conception of the world was still so Soviet, so back from 1979 Leningrad, that I think my friends became more than most friends, and I've always really loved, you know, very recently I threw a party. You attended that party that I had for the New York Times when they did an article about, you know, our country friendships, and it felt so it just felt very nice that everywhere I live, I'm able to find a group that is in so many ways reminds me of the original group of friends that I made when I first began making friends in America, which didn't happen until many years had passed before I began to form friendships because language difficulties, etc. And actually, the first friends I had in America were Russians because I couldn't speak the language well, and they were living across the river from where we live now. We live on the east bank of the Hudson River, and the bungalow colony was about half an hour away on the west bank. And it was only Russians. We only came there for the summer. And it was, where I made my first friends, where I fell in love for the first time. All of these things happened and were partially facilitated by the fact that people there wouldn't make fun of me as a Russian because we were all Russians.
There's a and please, if there's any more, this is a great time to start bombarding Gary with difficult and uncomfortable questions that he would rather not answer, but is forced to because he's here. The question is, how did you dream up the delirium sequence? Anything I can. How did you dream up the delirium sequence in the book?
Yes. Without giving too many spoilers away, yes, there is a character who becomes very ill and goes through these memories, but also, yes, a form of delirium and a form of sort of disassociation or disconnection from reality. About 5 months, even less, maybe about 4 months into writing the book, just as I was getting to that part of the book, I myself fell very ill, and I wrote about this in the New Yorker. A surgery that was done to me when I was very young, when I had come to America, completely fell apart, so to speak, and I was in tremendous pain for about half a year, if not more. And you almost can't imagine, you're about to start writing about someone who's in terrible pain and goes through delirium, and then it happens to you. It's almost like, life imitating art 100%. But I was prescribed all these different things. It was nerve damage that was the cause of the pain. And I was prescribed a medication, I think it's called gabapentin, which is an anticonvulsant drug that is designed to treat nerve pain. And not designed to treat nerve, it's designed as an anticonvulsant, but is used to treat nerve pain. So I was prescribed a high dosage of it, and I started popping those pills. But one of the effects for me was a sense of complete disassociation and hallucinations. So for a while, for example, I kept asking my wife, is there a bee in the room? Is there a fly in the room? I started imagining things. It was absolutely scary. Nothing like this had ever happened to me. But at the same time, I was trying to finish the last part of this novel. So there was, and I took this drug for a while, then I just abandoned it. But for a while, I was in pain. I was trying to finish the novel, writing about someone in pain. And the way this drug kind of crested, there were maybe 3 hours in the day where the hallucinations would stop and I would still be able to write something. But as I wrote, I would be inspired by the hallucinations that had just happened. I mean, it was just bonkers. The whole thing was so unusual. People say, write what you know. And at that point, I was writing literally what had happened a second ago. So it became like this endless nesting doll of reality, right? Where I was writing about a pandemic as it was happening. And then I was writing about a person falling apart physically as I was falling apart physically. And so, so the last, 30% of the book may read a little bit differently. The first 2/3, I'm leaning very heavily on humor because, most of my writing is fairly humorous. And then things really began to change.
There's a question from Olga. Do you see this book being made into a movie, TV show, or a stage play? And if you could choose one, which version would fit this novel the best?
It's so funny. So now that the book is out, people are reaching out to me about adaptations. And I thought film would sort of make sense, although I could absolutely see it as a theater play, given that it's broken up into 4 acts, for example. So there's obviously a very easy way to do that. But today I was talking to someone at a network who was thinking about a limited series, which is my very natural way of doing things. I love limited series. Limited series are the best. Oh my God. I just can't get enough of them. A good 6-7 episodes and you're done and it's over. But at the same time, every week you're looking forward to something new. It's almost the way during times of Dickens that everything was done in installments. You know, people would be waiting on the dock in America to get the latest chapter of the Dickens. I actually like things like HBO, the way they break it up, because, you know, as opposed to streaming everything, or Hulu actually does that too, where it's week by week as opposed to just one giant jumble you can binge on, because I like that feeling of wondering throughout the week, processing what you had just seen and thinking, well, what's going to happen next, right? So to me, in some ways, a limited series would be very delicious. So I hope something like that happens.
There's another question from Paolo. I'm interested in the way you describe making friends as a young person growing up in New York, friendship in the novel, and also the description of friend moves in the Barry character in Lake Success. We've got a cross conversation, cross books. Is there a relationship or similarity between how you describe your own friendships and the way friendships are portrayed in your characters?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people I know, myself very much included, you know, we're desperate for socialization, but the way we grew up, socialization comes very hard. I mean, you know, I speak English real good now, but even so, you know, I do find myself sometimes, you know, I could be at a faculty party or something, and I'm standing there with my glass of white wine and kind of, I still feel like I have to almost run a script in my mind. Interestingly enough, you know, Lake Success was partially about people on different parts of the spectrum, the autism spectrum, and I was, and so many, I know so many people who are on that spectrum, whether, you know, whether what was at that point called Asperger's and now is wrapped into the entire autism spectrum. But to me, writing, you know, and when I talk to therapists who work with autistic adults and autistic children, you know, there's this thing about scripting, knowing how to script a conversation, knowing about social cues really is what you know, it's a disorder of communication in some ways. And so for me, I always did that as a kid, in part because not knowing English. So I would always program in my own mind, if people ask me this, what do I say? I don't know what the Mets are. I don't know what the Yankees are. You know, I'm trying to research all this stuff about American culture, but also constantly running a program. And I think a lot of my friends are like that too. And my kids goes to a school which also is predominantly, I think, immigrants. It's another one of those math schools. And I see these kids interact, and there's this kind of tenuousness about it. And they're trying to sort of, they're all growing up with different languages in their background, and they're all trying to communicate. And it's just very, you know, it's to me, it's very charming, those breaks in communication, the way, you know, the way people often talk at cross purposes. And I think a lot of smart people have that kind of problem. You know, they're greats on the page, you know, and they're great. And so many authors I've met who I'm not going to name them, but who I've worshipped, and then you meet them in real life and they can barely get a sentence out, you know. There's others who can pontificate for hours on end, but so many of them are so, they're really at home on the page. And one of my favorite novels of all time is Nabokov's novel Pnin, which I prefer to such a greater extent than I do Lolita or Pale Fire. Those are wonderful books. But to me, Pnin, it is in part about the immigrant experience, and it's also about a person who desperately wants to connect with others, who desperately wants to make friends with others, but is constantly misinterpreted, in part because he doesn't speak English well, but also in part because he doesn't really know how to read social cues, especially in America. And that creates such heartache on behalf of the reader, you know, as you read this. And to me, that is Nabokov's most humane book. And in some ways, you know, it's where Nabokov becomes more, not just sensitive, but vulnerable in some ways. Because in some ways, even though Nabokov was this suave gentleman from a very wealthy Russian family, I think in part he himself felt that fear of coming up short in this new country.
I was fascinated by this question. And the questioner knows it's a crazy question. What painter would you have to paint a portrait of this quasi family of friends?
Oh my God. Boy, what's his name? The German guy that painted the Red Army faction portraits. Richter, Gerhard Richter?
Richter? Yeah, Richter.
Yeah,
Richter.
I wonder what he would do with that, because sometimes he has groups of people in his portraits, you know. In the book, I think I referred to paintings by Goya of the courtiers of the Spanish court in whatever, you know, 16th or 17th century in which he operated. And Yes, I love group portraits. And there's something, you know, and group portraits usually are of nobility. And these people, some of them are nobles in our sense, but others are not. And I think there's just something so vivid about 6 or 7 people arranged around a dinner table. The book also has a lot of food. And eating a lot of food is something we do upstate. And Dinaw, you're an incredible cook. I wish I had some of your skills. You really know your way around a, you know, a piece of meat and some crudité. You're really good. So, but yes, the idea of people gathered around the feast, around a table, I think that's so elemental to any culture around the world. And I think that, you know, this book actually sort of revolves around 2 or 3 or 4 dinner scenes in a big way.
Yeah. And it's also, I mean, the very thing that's obviously kind of at risk under the pandemic, right, is actually that act of gathering and then also eating. You know, early on in the book, you see them, you know, putting on gloves as they begin to sort of prepare the food. And even as there's still a kind of joy inside of the consumption, there's also, you know, they're separated, they're sitting far away from each other. Is it the same? Yeah.
No, I remember the first time I had friends, our mutual friends, who would come over to our house to grill in the summer of 2020. And we were all wearing masks outside because at this point we still didn't know what was going on, and gloves. And, you know, the passing of the salad bowl is this act of danger. You know? Here you have a salad, the most innocuous kind of food imaginable, you know, and you're like, you know, and you know, in the book, there's this restaurant that's known for its hand sanitizer, and people, once restaurants begin to reopen outdoor seating, people flock to this one restaurant because it has really great hand sanitizer. And there was this restaurant that I thought had amazing hand sanitizer in this little village next to us, and I would go there. The food was okay, but oh man, you could really clean your hands so beautifully. Yeah. You know, details like that began to make their way in the novel. You know.
Did you ever wonder if it was, you know, normally the idea that, you know, an experience happens and then we process it and then we write about it, but we're still in the middle of this. We're in a different phase of it, obviously, than we were at the beginning. Or did it seem like you wanted to capture it while it was still fresh?
Yeah. I would say this. Look, the pandemic is a terrible crisis, but the way the world operates right now, there's going to be one crisis after the next. You know, there's a young girl in this book who's 8 years old, and the characters in the book are constantly thinking, well, what's her future going to be like? You know, there's a lot of nostalgia for our past, but boy, you know, in some ways, the Clinton era looked like a really nice time compared to some of the things we've just been through, you know, as problematic as some things were during the Clinton era. But also you know, obviously the environmental degradation, the fact that, you know, I don't know what the situation is in Oklahoma and Tulsa, but, you know, my friends who live on the West Coast are going through one disaster after the next. You know, it never ends for them. So, you know, I was just reading an article about where to live in America, given all the horrors of water shortage, forest fires, increased climate, the shorelines receding in places like New York. And the answer was that the best place to live is Buffalo, New York. It's going to be the most climate resilient city in America. So, you know, I mean, wherever you are, whether you're in Tulsa or somewhere else, if you're thinking of a place to move, give Buffalo a try, because it even is not going to be ravaged by killer mosquitoes, which is going to be a big problem by the year 2100 or something. So, but that feeling of we are constantly going to be living on a knife's edge means that fiction is going to have to adapt too, that it's going to be harder to write just books that are small personal stories that don't in some ways, I think, have a background. And you know this, you know, you and I both come from parts of the world that have experienced incredible upheaval in the past century, where so many have died through politics and environmental disasters, etc. You know, I can't imagine, as I'm sure you can't, writing about, you know, life in Russia or Ethiopia without that being some part of the background, as you've done in your own work, you know. And I think the same may be coming true for America as well. It's just going to be very hard it's going to be hard to ignore that background, even if what you want to do is concentrate on topics like friendship and love and families.
Thank you, Gary, for that one
Thank you so much,
conversation. I think
Dinaw.
we're
Thank you.
just about out of time, unless anybody wants to throw one more question in. I see behind you, you have a fine bottle of Our Country Friends on the shelf.
Yes, yes. This is, you know, nowadays everything, you can't just have a book, you also have to have a wine that goes with it. And this is Our Country Friends. The wine is from a lovely, it's from the Millbrook Winery, which is right near us in upstate New York. It's a very frisky wine. It has an aftertaste of friendship, some notes of love. I love this wine. I could drink it all night.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I believe that is the end of our conversation. Please remember to support this absolutely fantastic bookstore, Magic City Books, and purchase Gary's book this evening. Have a good evening, and I'll hopefully see you soon, Gary.
Yes, me too. Take care. Thanks so much, Dinaw. Bye, everyone. Ciao.